Greg Holloway had barely unpacked his flannel shirts before Timberbrooks HOA sent its first love letter. A violation. He read it twice. Suspicious vapor activity and noise pollution from unauthorized backyard installation. Noise pollution. The only sound he'd made was the low hum of his hot tub cycling at dusk. He bought the place to escape noise. No cars. No subways. Just the hush of pines and the hiss of mountain wind. The letter was signed in loopy cursive by Karen Littman, HOA secretary. Of course, Greg had met her once during escrow. She showed up uninvited during the home inspection, complaining about pine needles and deer tracks. She was the kind of neighbor who smiled while counting your sins. But this was quick. For her still, Greg didn't feel the full sting until Sunday evening. After a long weekend in the city, he parked beside his cabin, caught a whiff of something sour in the air, and frowned. His hot tub cover, usually sealed tight, was peeled halfway open. Steam still rolled off the surface, but the water level was low. Worse, a crusty ring of pinkish scum rimmed the jets. Something oily clung to the cover flap. He pulled it fully open and recoiled. The water was murky, cloudy, and stank of sweet shampoo and mildew. The filters hissed and groaned. He grabbed his phone and opened his wildlife camera feed. The cabin backed up to a thicket of pine where Greg had set up motion-triggered surveillance, hoping to spot bears. Instead, he found Karen. There she was, Friday night, barefoot in a plush robe, holding a wine glass like some lodge queen. She tiptoed across his deck, plopped into his tub, and settled in with an audible sigh. Minutes later, music started, some tinny 90s pop from a Bluetooth speaker she balanced on the rim. She stayed for 57 minutes. At one point, she dunked her head under, then rose up like a drenched sea creature, hair slicked back, laughing at nothing. At 12:09 a.m., she stumbled out, drained half a bottle of wine into the bushes, and left the lid open to the cold. Greg watched the footage twice. It wasn't just trespassing, it was invasive, disrespectful, and utterly bizarre. By Monday, he'd cleaned the tub and replaced the filters, but something about it felt ruined, like someone had snuck into your bed while you were away. He walked over to her house that evening. Karen answered the door in another robe, sipping tea like she was hosting a spa retreat. "Greg," she chirped, "isn't it lovely up here?" "Have footage," he said flatly. "You used my hot tub while I was gone." She didn't blink. "Oh, I assumed you wouldn't mind. This community's always shared amenities. That's not how ownership works." Karen waved him off like a fly. "Relax. It's just water and bubbles. The HOA fined me because of you." Her eyes twinkled with innocence. "Well, I did have a bit of a reaction afterward. My skin's been terribly red. Might have been the chemicals you used." He stared. "You broke into my property, contaminated my water, and blamed me for a rash?" She leaned in, whispering like a villain in a stage play. "Be careful how you talk to me, Greg. People up here don't like conflict." He left without another word. That night, he rewatched the video. Something caught his eye. Karen had spilled something into the water. A small vial or bottle. He zoomed in. The label was blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. Essential oils. Greg's jaw tightened. Whatever she poured in, it wasn't made for a filtration system. She'd poisoned the water, framed him, and now she was weaponizing the HOA to push him out. But what Karen didn't know was that Greg wasn't leaving. She wanted to soak. She was about to get burned. On Tuesday morning, Greg was pouring coffee when he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a man in a pressed polo and Timberbrook HOA badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Holloway?" the man began. "I'm Craig with the HOA Compliance Division. We've had a medical complaint filed against your property." Greg blinked. "Hey, what?" "There was a reported incident involving chemical exposure in your spa unit. One of our board members experienced severe skin irritation after a soak. We're investigating potential code violations." Greg didn't bother hiding his disbelief. "She trespassed. I have video footage." Craig gave a polite shrug, as if Greg had mentioned the weather. "Regardless of how she accessed the hot tub, the HOA takes exposure risks seriously. We're recommending you cease use until testing clears it." Greg stood on his porch as the man snapped photos of the jacuzzi like it was a crime scene. He wanted to scream, but something deeper was bubbling under his frustration. Now curiosity. He hadn't added any strange chemicals. His water routine was textbook. Bromine tablets, weekly filter cleans, pH balance check. The only anomaly was Karen and that mystery vial she dumped in. Back inside, he scrolled through HOA files online. Timberbrook's bylaws were long, tedious, and contradicting. But one thing was clear. Karen had pulled stunts like this before. In a forum thread from last year, a homeowner named Marvin had posted about mysterious brown mulch appearing on his lawn just before being cited for invasive landscaping. The board sided with Karen then too. Greg messaged Marvin. The reply came within the hour. "Karen will push you until you snap. Then she'll call it aggression and vote you into a fine. She owns the board." That evening, Greg drove into town and knocked on an old friend's door. Cal, a lab technician at the county college. They'd done some minor real estate deals together, but more importantly, Cal owed Greg a favor. "I need a water test," Greg said, quiet and unofficial. Cal raised an eyebrow. Pool party gone wrong. Something like that. By Thursday, the results came back. There were elevated levels of methyl salicylate and eucalyptus common in concentrated essential oils, the kind that could clog filters and cause skin burns if mixed improperly. And one other thing, trace amounts of hydrolyzed silk protein. Cal squinted at the sheet. That's usually found in beauty products. Skin serum, fancy conditioner, not supposed to be in circulation systems. Greg remembered Karen dunking her head, laughing like she was in some medieval healing bath. She hadn't just trespassed, transformed his hot tub into her own. Makeshift spa experiment. Friday brought another letter. This time, it wasn't a violation. It was a petition. Karen was proposing a bylaw change, shared use of recreational water installations, arguing that isolated ownership of luxuries like spas and pools created division in the neighborhood. If passed, it would allow registered HOA members supervised access to private outdoor installations, unless owners submitted a written objection reviewed by the board. Greg stared at the paper in disbelief. It was madness, but presented with Karen's signature blend of passive-aggressive wellness and faux community spirit. At the bottom was a QR code to vote. Greg didn't scan it. Instead, he opened his laptop, downloaded the video footage of midnight soak, and stitched together a short clip, including the moment she poured her vial into the water, followed by her stumbling wine-sloshed exit. He saved it to a folder titled Exhibit A. It was time to fight fire with truth, and when truth soaked in, it burned worse than bromine. Greg didn't notice the buzzing at first. It was subtle at first, just a light hum, as he stepped out onto the deck that Saturday morning. He squatted beside the hot tub to inspect the filter again, and heard it clearer. A low, angry drone coming from beneath the deck boards. He lifted one of the planks with a crowbar. What he found made him recoil. A writhing cluster of wasps, packed into a muddy nest the size of a volleyball. They pulsed in unison, disturbed by the sudden light, wings twitching like a loaded spring. And nearby, a tunnel network of sawdust carpenter ants. He spotted dozens of them crawling along the wooden supports, carving away at the beams. The entire underside of his jacuzzi platform had turned into a multi-insect Airbnb. Greg dropped the plank and took 3 steps back. He spent the next hour researching pest behavior. The nest was too large to deal with alone. And it wasn't just bugs, it was a signal. Nature was reclaiming the space Karen had violated. Mold spores, silk proteins, essential oils. They'd turned the tub into a botanical beacon for every moisture-loving insect in the forest. He called 2 local exterminators. Both were booked until the following week. Then came the HOA. Knocked out. This time it wasn't Craig. It was a woman named Lynn from the Environmental Standards Committee. She wore a beige windbreaker and had a clipboard covered in plastic to protect it from imaginary rain. Mr. Holloway, we've received a complaint about pest infestation and unmaintained structures. Greg narrowed his eyes. From whom? I can't disclose that, she said cheerfully. But it's our duty to inspect when a homeowner's property may pose a threat to the ecosystem balance of She peered under the deck. Greg let her. What else could he do? She gasped. Oh dear, that's a mature wasp colony. And ants, too. You'll need to submit a full abatement plan within 72 hours, or face citation. Greg clenched his jaw. They're only here because someone left the spa open and spilled. I'm not here to assign blame, Lynn said, scribbling notes. Just to uphold the harmony. He followed her back toward the front yard. As they turned the corner, Karen was in her garden, perfectly timed. She wore a wide sun hat, long sleeves despite the heat, and gloves that couldn't fully conceal the red splotches still crawling up her wrists and neck. Her arms were raw now, the rash worse than ever. She gave Greg a neighborly wave. Just weeding. Love to see our community thriving. He didn't return the wave. Instead, he walked back inside, slammed the door, and opened his laptop. It was time for his own kind of pest control. He uploaded the video compilation. Karen entering his yard, climbing into his hot tub, spilling the contents of the vial, soaking for nearly an hour, and leaving the lid open. He added slow motion to the key moment. She emptied the vial and applied a timestamp overlay for clarity. He emailed the video to the board under the subject line, "OA trespass evidence potential fraud and contamination." Within the hour, he received a response not from the board, but from a neighbor he didn't even know. Saw the footage. About time someone stood up to her. She did the same thing to my pond heater last winter. The trickle turned to a stream. 5 more emails. Arrived by nightfall. Stories, grievances, old slights. One homeowner said Karen once cited them for decorative bark being too red. Greg smiled grimly. She hadn't just made one enemy, she'd made many. Now the hive was waking up, and Karen was standing right in its center, still itching, still smiling. For now. By Monday morning, Greg's inbox had turned into a confession booth. There were a dozen emails from neighbors, people he'd never spoken to. Most began the same way, "You don't know me," and ended with stories of fines, inspections, and mysterious citations, all traceable to Karen Littman. She had once reported a man for hanging wind chimes, Another was fined for leaving his trash bins out past acceptable sunset. One woman even claimed her rose bushes were slashed during the night after she voted against a Karen-backed petition. But what stood out most was the pattern Karen always cited bylaws. She wielded the HOA handbook like scripture, memorized and sharp-edged. Greg began to wonder how much of it was legitimate. That's how he ended up in a musty records room beneath the Timber County Courthouse, standing under flickering fluorescent lights with a stack of aging HOA documents that smelled faintly of mildew and decades-old coffee. Looking for something specific? Asked the clerk, an older man in glasses who looked like he hadn't blinked in 30 years. Timberbrook HOA charter files. Greg said, original bylaws. The stuff they don't publish online. The man handed over a cardboard box. Hope you brought patience. Greg found it in the third folder, a yellowed packet titled Addendum for B, Residential Property Rights and Recreational Installations. It had been filed 17 years ago, long before Karen joined the board, and it changed everything, the clause stated. Private amenities installed and funded solely by individual homeowners are to be considered exclusive use property, not subject to HOA, common use doctrine, meaning Greg's hot tub was indisputably private. There was no legal precedent, none for Karen's shared wellness argument. In fact, by using it, she had violated his rights. But it got worse for her. He found another document, this one newer, a funding request signed by Karen herself 3 years ago, requesting HOA funds to replace deteriorating exterior features. The payout was approved for $8,450, but the address listed was Karen's. Greg jotted down the details, heart thudding. If he was reading this right, Karen had used HOA money to renovate her own home, luxury double-pane windows listed under whether. That wasn't just unethical, that was fraud. By the time he left the courthouse, the sun was dipping below the trees. A storm was building over Timberbrook, literally and metaphorically. Back at the cabin, Greg found an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a letter with neat, aggressive handwriting. Cease and desist any distribution of private footage. Further escalation will result in legal consequences for defamation and harassment. Karen Lippman, Secretary, Timberbrook, HOA. There was no official letterhead, no attorney's name, just Karen. He read it once. Then he burned it in his fireplace. That night, Greg sat on his porch with a beer, the wind carrying pine needles and little swirling cyclones across the deck. He listened again to the buzzing beneath the boards. The wasps had doubled in number. Let them. Let the infestation bloom. Let the rot show. That's what Karen had built this HOA on anyway. Secrets under floorboards. Infestations of controlled disguised as order. He opened his laptop and started drafting a letter, not to the board, but to every homeowner on the Timberbrook mailing list. He would attach addendum for B and the renovation documents, and maybe, just maybe, the video footage. Let the neighbors decide who really needed a cease and desist. The queen of the hive was about to lose her crown. Karen was unraveling. At first, Greg thought it was just more of her flair for dramatics. She'd always dressed like a woman on the brink of a suburban opera, wide-brimmed hats, long gloves, thick sunglasses. But now she wore scarves around her neck, even in the heat. Her sleeves stretched to her wrists, and even from across the street, Greg could see her scratching constantly. Her garden, once trimmed and boastful, had withered. The roses were sagging, their petals browning at the edges. The lavender hedges she'd bragged about now buzzed with insects that didn't seem friendly. Greg noticed her spraying them with something one morning. A thick white mist clung to the air. She hacked and coughed into her scarf as she backed away. Then came the HOA bulletin. Typed in bold. Notice 2 residents. Sudden increase in skin irritations and airborne allergens. Several Timberbrook residents have reported unusual rashes, eye inflammation, and respiratory discomfort. Environmental testing pending. Greg nearly laughed out loud. She wasn't just sabotaging him anymore, she'd poisoned the entire neighborhood. He knew it had started from his jacuzzi, or rather, from what she'd dumped in it. He forwarded Cal's water report, the one that listed the unnatural spike in methyl salicylate and silk protein, to the HOA inbox. Then, as a final measure, he emailed it to 3 neighbors who'd written him that week. Just a nudge. Just enough to push the conversation off the leash. By Wednesday, it was out of his hands. A neighborhood WhatsApp group was formed. Truthers Karen wasn't in it, but she was very much its subject. Posts started coming in like waves. Has anyone seen what she sprays in her yard at night? My son broke out in hives after playing in our sprinkler. Do you think it's connected to the rash Karen keeps talking about? Greg stayed quiet. He didn't need to lead this. The fire was catching without him. On Thursday, he spotted a man with a handheld device and sampling vials near the corner of Karen's house. An environmental inspector. The HOA had called someone in. She hadn't just lost control, she was now under surveillance by her own system. But that wasn't even the best part. That came Friday, when Greg heard rustling by the fence line. He crept to the side of his cabin and peeked through the pine branches. Karen was at the edge of his property again, staring at the hot tub like it owed her something. Her skin was worse now, red and raw, like she'd spent too long under a heat lamp. She was scratching her neck, muttering something he couldn't hear. Then, out of nowhere, she spat at the tub. It landed short, a pathetic little fleck on the rocks. She looked around, startled as if waking up from a daze, then stumbled back toward her house. Greg stood there for a long moment. Something was wrong with her, worse than a rash or a vendetta. She was unraveling at the seams. He went back inside and locked the doors. That night, the wind howled, louder than usual. Branches thumped the roof. The wasps beneath the deck buzzed, like a fever dream. Greg didn't sleep. He didn't even try, because the next step wasn't just defending his property anymore. It was rooting out whatever Karen had started and whatever was spreading because of it. The storm passed by morning, but the air in Timberbrook felt heavier, wet, electric, almost sickly sweet. Greg noticed a new sheen on the pine needles outside, like something oily had drifted through the trees during the night. He could still hear the wasps under the deck, buzzing harder than ever. Karen hadn't come outside once, which made what Greg was about to do both safer and a lot more satisfying. He set up the trap with precision. A spare hot tub cover from a neighbor's discarded model, a cheap inflatable spa he'd bought online, and a trail of lavender oil leading up to it. He filled the decoy tub with warm water, added a few harmless ingredients to make the steam rise thicker, and then, as the final touch, he mixed in a very active dye, harmless, invisible to the eye, but under a black light, it would glow like wildfire. Greg positioned his camera higher this time, hidden in a bird feeder angled directly at the tub. Motion activated, set to record. Then he waited. Nothing on night 1. On night 2, he almost gave up, but just past 11 p.m. The camera blinked to life. She appeared like a shadow crane in her robe, hair frizzed, face pale. She crept through the trees this time instead of using the front gate. The gloves were gone. Her arms were wrapped in gauze. She moved like her joints didn't fit right anymore. She stood over the tub and stared at it like it was a temple. Then, without hesitation, she climbed in. No music this time. No whine. Just the slow submerging of a woman who had officially lost her tether to reality. She sat there motionless for 15 minutes. Then, just as she'd done before, she reached into her robe and pulled out a small dark bottle. She poured it in. Greg hit save. The following morning, HOA inboxes exploded. He didn't send it anonymously. He signed it proudly. Subject: ongoing trespassing and contamination incident. Footage attached within the hour. Karen's porch was crawling with HOA officials and 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office. Greg didn't need to listen to know what they were saying. The video had gone through the chain of command like lightning, but the final blow came from the die. By afternoon, Karen emerged from her home clutching papers, shouting at the board president on her lawn. She looked completely deranged, and she was glowing. Not metaphorically. Under the pale sun, faint streaks of neon green ran across her neck, her wrists, and down the side of her leg. The dye had soaked into her gauze. She hadn't washed properly. One of the HOA volunteers who'd seen the video stepped forward with a UV flashlight. Click. Her entire arm lit up like a circuit board. People gasped. Karen backed away, screaming something about allergic reactions, about curses and poisoned air. No one listened. The sheriff raised a hand, calm but firm, and asked her to come with him. Greg stood at his deck, arms folded. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating, because even as Karen was driven away, her house sat dark and quiet and full of something unresolved. The rash was only the surface. Something deeper had sunk into Timberbrook, into the trees, the ground, the water. She wasn't just trespassing. She had opened something. And now, Greg could feel it watching him. 2 days after Karen was escorted off her lawn, the Timberbrook board convened an emergency meeting in the community lodge. Greg arrived early, not because he wanted to, but because he knew Karen would have. He claimed a corner seat where he could watch the room, its faces, its fractures. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the air smelled of burnt coffee and tension. Across from him sat Janet, the HOA president, dabbing sweat from her upper lip with a trembling napkin. She had always been Karen's alike, signed letters, led wellness walks, pushed for ornamental fencing restrictions, but now she wouldn't meet Greg's eyes. "Let's come to order," she said weakly. "We'll begin with item 1 concerning misuse of personal property, unsanctioned bylaws, and chemical hazards related to Mrs. Littman." The board shuffled nervously. Greg stood, no permission asked. He placed a manila folder on the table and opened it. "Item 1 is evidence of trespassing," he said. "Video, still images, witness statements." Item 2 is a certified copy of Addendum for B protecting exclusive use, recreational property. Item 3. He pulled out a set of county reimbursement records. Is proof that Karen used HOA funds to install personal luxury upgrades to her home under the guise of community improvements. A long pause. One board member whispered to another. Janet sat still, her napkin now clenched in both fists like a prayer. "I move for a special vote," Greg said. "A motion to remove Karen Littman from her board position effective immediately, and conduct a full audit of financial transactions from the last 5 years." Another neighbor, Marvin, from the pond heater incident, stood up beside him. Seconded, he said. What followed was chaos. Raised voices, confusion. Another neighbor shouting that he too had been threatened with legal action over a hammock. Someone else waved a printed screenshot of Karen's glowing arm under the UV flashlight, claiming she'd hexed the community. Greg said nothing. He'd already won. He could feel it like the silence before a storm. The vote passed. Unanimously, Karen Littman was officially removed from the HOA board, but that wasn't what rattled Greg. It was what happened after. As people left the lodge, shaken but buzzing with energy, Janet pulled him aside. Listen, she whispered. We didn't know she'd gone this far. Greg raised an eyebrow. But you knew something. Janet bit her lip. Last winter, she mentioned something about an herbalist. Said she'd found a way to purify the HOA from bad energy. I thought it was just more of her essential oil nonsense. But then she brought in a man foreign, quiet, called him a cleansing specialist. He visited the neighborhood 3 times, always at night. Afterward, she said the energy around the lodge had settled. Greg frowned. Did he do anything to the water lines? I don't know. But my tap ran black the morning after one of his visits. She hesitated, then slipped a slip of paper into his hand. An address, not Karen's. Somewhere up the mountain. A cabin. Deeper in the woods. He stayed there. She paid him under the table. Greg left the lodge with the address folded in his pocket. His car's headlights caught the edge of Karen's dark house on the hill. The windows were shuttered. The air around it shimmered strangely, like heat waves from a fire that hadn't started yet. Whatever Karen had done, whatever she'd summoned or stirred, it hadn't left with her. And now Greg knew where it came from. Tomorrow, he would go to that cabin. But tonight, he'd lock the doors and stay inside, because something had started moving beneath Timberbrook, and it wasn't just wasps anymore. The road to the cabin was barely a road, just a gravel spit, swallowed by trees and fog. Greg's SUV rumbled over it like a trespasser in its own right. Pines loomed overhead, thick and dark, their trunks mossy and crooked. There were no mailboxes here. No signs of life. Except for the cabin. It sat at the edge of a clearing like it had grown there, gray and hunched. Its roof dipped in moss and its chimney cracked like a split tooth. No cars, no lights. But something about the place vibrated with wrongness. Greg cut the engine and stepped out. The air was thick, warmer than it should have been, and there was a scent again. Faint, sweet, almost medicinal. Lavender, but wrong. Burnt lavender. Like perfume overwrought. He approached slowly, phone in hand, camera ready. Each creak of the porch boards under his boots sounded like a warning. Knocked. Silence. Then movement. Something shifted behind the warped curtain of the leftmost window. A shadow, then another, too tall, too still. The door opened before he could raise his hand again. An old man stood in the threshold, barefoot, no expression. His eyes were pale, like glass left out in the sun. His skin was gray, not pale, not sick. Gray. Greg Holloway, he said, voice low and dry as paper. You came to the wellspring. Greg swallowed. Are you the one Karen hired? The man stepped aside. She opened the gate. But you're the one who fed it. Greg didn't move. Fed what? The man's lips twitched into something like a smile. Your water, your heat, your hive, that tub of yours. It boiled more than bones. It woke something. I came for answers, Greg said. Not cryptic campfire stories. The man didn't respond. He just turned and walked deeper into the cabin. Greg followed. Inside, the air was thick and damp. Jars lined every shelf. Fruits, powders, hair. One shelf was filled with nothing but fingernails. Another held cloudy jars of murky liquid things, floating inside that didn't move quite right. But at the center of the room was a bowl, ceramic, cracked and bubbling. Steam rose off it just like the hot tub. The man pointed. She used the oils wrong, broke the binding. What seeped through? He trailed off, eyes flicking toward Greg, latched onto her. And you? I didn't pour anything in, Greg muttered. No, the man said. You kept it warm. Greg stepped back. The bowl's bubbles were slowing now, thickening, as if something beneath the surface was trying to breathe. I don't want any part of this, Greg said. You already took part, the man said, voice softer. It's in your home, in your deck boards, in your pipes. He reached into a drawer and handed Greg a box black wood, sealed with wax. Burn this in the water, he said. All of it, before the next moon, or it will crawl deeper. Greg didn't wait for another word. He left the cabin, drove down the gravel path, didn't look in the mirror once. That night, he poured the box's contents into his jacuzzi, dried herbs, bones, something oily that hissed on contact. He lit the match. The flame bloomed blue. The steam rose silent. Then, a shriek, not from his deck, from Karen's house. He turned. Through her window, just before it shattered, he saw her face twisted red, blistered like lava, and crawling with something tiny legs, a wasp's wing, a second mouth. Then the window blew inward and all the lights in Timberbrook went dark. When they came back hours later, Karen's house was empty, no body, no heat, just a hot tub in her backyard, half full of cloudy water, still steaming. Greg never used his again. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right, He hears it bubbling out there, like it's waiting for someone else to take a soak. The end.